So if you've been following loot box news, then you will know that a major development has been the introduction of a loot box bill in the United States. This bill was introduced by a Republican senator known as Josh Hawley, who intends to specifically target loot boxes as well as pay-to-win microtransactions. So obviously this whole debacle began with Star Wars Battlefront 2 and its pay-to-win microtransactions and loot boxes that gained a lot of traction. Before we knew it, government officials like Hawaii State Representative Chris Lee kind of got on board and said, yeah, this is not right, we're gonna try to stop this. But things have fizzled out in the United States specifically. Whereas countries like Belgium and Netherlands have made a lot of headway, in those two countries, loot boxes are pretty much banned. A lot of companies have had to pull loot boxes from their games, and Nintendo more recently, they had to shut down the mobile Fire Emblem and Animal Crossing games in those countries because they fear that legislation might catch up to them. As for other countries in Europe, a lot of them have expressed that they have heard the concerns. They have said that they're gonna try to investigate this and whatnot. Some countries haven't legally declared loot boxes as gambling, but they do know that they're an issue, and so it's about the law catching up essentially. And then you've got countries like South Korea who are conducting their own investigation. So at the very least, the conversation is getting a lot of traction. The world is sort of becoming more and more aware that loot boxes are a thing. Now with US sort of being the world leader country, them pitching in is a big deal. So Hawley's bill, if it actually makes it through, will definitely make waves. But there is the if factor. We don't know if this bill is going to go through. It might fall through the cracks for any number of reasons. And furthermore, the agenda surrounding it is unknown. I'm not sure how earnest the motivation behind this bill is, which is why Kotaku editor Jason Schreier reached out to Senator Hawley to discuss the bill itself as well as what the agenda behind it is. You can check out the article itself through a link in the description below, but I'm just going to be providing the bullet points, the key pieces of information. So Jason began by asking if Hawley himself is a gamer, if he has some kind of personal stake in this. Hawley admitted that he himself isn't a gamer, but at the same time he is like a parent and he's just concerned about the general health risks that stuff like loot boxes could have on children who are exposed to them. For him, it's more about the prospect of kids potentially being able to access gambling-like mechanics in games. It's more about games turning into casinos for children, essentially. Jason then asked Hawley if his kids currently play video games. He admitted that they do not, since they're 4 and 6 now, but he has apparently heard concerns from parents who are seeing charges on their credit card that they don't know anything about that actually come from a video game because the kids took the credit card and decided to spend it all on microtransactions, on coveted items and features and such. He also acknowledged how gamers themselves just aren't happy when these mechanics are implemented because it changes the design of the whole game, it mars the integrity of the design, and the game itself is essentially fundamentally changed so that the focus becomes monetization rather than fun. Jason then proceeded to ask why he's focusing specifically on loot boxes when kids can spend money on other types of microtransactions as well that may not involve RNG and random elements. Hawley clarified that on top of targeting loot boxes, he's also going after anything that may be pay to win. And the reason for this is because these mechanics are similar in that they can be addictive and psychologically manipulative. So even if there isn't a random element, pay to win might somehow entice you to keep spending, to keep winning or progressing through the game because the game's designed in such a way. And on the topic of loot boxes, he noted how casinos don't allow kids to access them. So he's asking, why should games get leeway on that front? Why should games that have gambling-like mechanics be accessible to children when they work exactly like casinos? Yeah, I think Hawley has the right idea here. The thing about loot boxes and pay-to-win microtransactions is that they are designed in such a way that you can spend infinitely on them, right? I mean, it's one thing to download a DLC, spend, $20 to $40 on that. That's a one-time expenditure. But if a kid wants a certain item and they find dad's credit card, they'll want to keep spending and rolling the dice until they get desired items. And that's where the danger comes in. So with loot boxes, the odds are sort of calculated in such a way that you'd have to open hundreds or thousands of loot boxes before you get one of the rare items. And then with pay-to-win microtransactions, you've got mobile games that sort of force you to wait until you can do certain tasks, and then players can pay money so that they can skip through that timer, that wait, and that's one aspect of pay to win. Or they may be enticed to get consumable items that can bolster aspects of the game and the progression. Things like that that'll keep players spending money because they're so focused on wanting to progress, and the game purposely hampers you from doing that. Now, Hawley seems to be specifically focused on kids and children, and Jason asked why that is when adults can also become exploited and addicted to this stuff. Hawley, in response, acknowledged that adults can be exploited as well, but cited children as a special case. He expressed that kids are uniquely vulnerable in that they may not entirely know the nature of what they're participating in, the full nature of what the microtransactions and loot boxes entail, and how they're designed and how they might manipulate them. I can agree with that. I think kids might just find the loot boxes fun without knowing that they're getting addicted, without fully understanding the psychological effects that they're having. Another important factor is that kids' minds are actually developing, so their psychological state is more malleable, so that opens them up to influence. It opens them up to being more prone to addiction down the line if they engage in that activity early on. That's not to say that adults don't matter, that we shouldn't keep adults in mind, but the kids are more vulnerable, their minds are developing, so I can see why they might take more of a priority. And plus, if you want to present an issue to the public, there is the matter of presentation, and not gonna lie, if you present it as kids being harmed, it's gonna garner more sympathy. So I think that may be one aspect of it that nobody's really mentioning, but I think they're definitely playing into that. From there, the conversation shifted to the Entertainment Software Association, which is the trade association that represents video games. This organization is pretty infamous currently for being complacent to loot boxes, to shady monetization tactics, because they're being lobbied by these big publishers to say that, oh, these are not harmful, these are not gambling, to root for them rather than try to regulate and eradicate them. At one point, they tried to pretend like they care by introducing the in-game purchases label, which really doesn't do anything. It labels loot boxes and DLCs as in-game purchases. There's no distinction between the more predatory stuff and just additional purchases that aren't predatory. Just useless shit that further indicates the ESA's goal is to delay the conversation and try to hide everything under the rug rather than tackle the issue head on. So on the topic of the ESA, Hawley was asked if he has reached out to that organization, and he confirmed that he indeed has. And then when inquired about how the conversation went, Hawley's senior policy advisor, Jacob Reeses, who was also in the interview, said the following: "I think it's fair to say the industry has concerns about this. We have been trying to be very transparent with them, but there may be some difference of opinion." Sounds to me like Reeses is putting it mildly. The gaming industry has made so much money from exploitative and manipulative monetization that they're gonna do everything in their power to ensure that mechanics like loot boxes and pay-to-win microtransactions are here to stay. Difference of opinion is probably just scratching the surface. The ESA and companies like EA, who have become so dependent on these loot boxes financially, will fight as hard as they can to ensure this bill doesn't go through, but I feel like at this point they're fighting the wind. Speaking of EA, Jason asked Hawley if he could further elaborate on the conversations he's had with the gaming industry, while mentioning that EA is reliant on loot boxes in games like FIFA for their business. And to that, Hawley responded with, quote, "And FIFA would indeed be covered by this legislation, to be clear. They have certainly expressed their, shall we say, concern over this legislation, but I think that's probably a good indication that we're getting somewhere." He says EA is concerned, but again, I think he's underselling it. That seems like a huge understatement. For EA in particular, a huge portion of their yearly revenue comes from loot boxes, specifically from the Ultimate Team mode found in sports titles like FIFA. Take that away and yeah, I mean, you can expect that EA's financial guidance will plummet and that stock for the company will take a nosedive because there's just going to be less money coming in, and we all know how much investors hate when a company is stagnating or dipping rather than growing indefinitely. This is sort of what can happen when you put all your eggs in one basket, and when that basket happens to be egregious monetization, that's bound to be regulated eventually, that's bound to attract the attention of government officials, stuff that's bound to be regulated. Jason then followed up by asking Hawley if he believes that this bill will actually go anywhere or if it'll just fizzle out like previous attempts. Jason also pointed out that there's a lot of skepticism among analysts and pundits that the bill will even pass. Others also apparently think that this might be a publicity stunt rather than a legit thing. To that, Hawley responded with this: I think if they thought it were a publicity stunt, they wouldn't be so concerned. I think the reaction of the corporate lobbyists sort of strongly suggests that they are very worried about this. I think it probably also suggests that they know this practice is not going to stand up to public scrutiny. Once parents really understand what's going on here, and once the general public understands how these games are being manipulated, how their integrity is being compromised, how basically these companies have found a way to make whole gobs of money without really being upfront about it, and of course the addictive nature of it, I think they're pretty worried that it's going to result in public backlash, and it should. Jason then pointed out how public backlash is one thing, but getting Congress to collaborate and care about this thing is another. To that, Hawley said that if you put it in terms of protecting the health of kids as well as the health of the general public, then it's just something that everyone will care about. So his hope is to keep driving the conversation of how games keep trying to extract money without regard for the integrity of a product and people's well-being. And for my part, I am gonna say that public backlash does in fact matter. It does play a role in terms of the government doing something about certain issues. After all, public backlash is the reason this whole conversation even got started. People speaking out is why this whole issue has gained so much traction among government bodies around the world. Countries like Netherlands and Belgium wouldn't have banned loot boxes without that public backlash. Other countries like Europe and Asian countries like South Korea wouldn't be investigating and looking into this without public backlash. And now we've got the USA, the FTC is conducting their own investigation, and now Hawley is introducing his bill. None of this would be happening without that public outcry to raise attention to this issue. The more traction an issue gains among the public, the more public outcry there is, the more likely it is that government officials will be drawn to the issue, whether it's because they actually care or because they're trying to win points with the public for the next election or whatever. Now, it's worth noting that there have been past attempts at video game regulation, and Jason pointed this out to Hawley. So stuff like the failed attempt to regulate violent games back in 2010 and 2011. This was a Supreme Court case that didn't pan out ultimately. And then there's, of course, Hawaii State Representative Chris Lee, who tried to introduce a loot box legislation that fizzled out in Hawaii. So Jason brought up these points, and he asked what's to say that this bill, your bill, Hawley, won't see a similar fate. To that, all Hawley had to say was, we'll see. He can't predict the future, but he's thinking that as more people talk about this issue, as the conversation becomes broader, it's just something that more people will care about. Next up, Jason brought up how Republicans tend to be more about personal accountability, and loot boxes and these microtransactions don't technically force anyone to spend money on them. So he asked, why not let the free market decide? To that, Hawley once again brought up the point of kids and how what they consume, what they're exposed to should be carefully regulated, which is why casinos ban kids, people under a certain age. Jason then once again raised the point that pay-to-win microtransactions aren't necessarily loot boxes, they aren't necessarily like casinos. And to that, Hawley said that pay-to-win is similar in that it is manipulative. So again, I'm gonna bring up the skip timer mechanic that's so popular in mobile games. So that stuff isn't gambling, but it takes advantage of people's impatience towards waiting, and it makes them want to buy that premium currency so they can spend it on skipping timers that constantly block your way through the game's progression. So it's not just about the notion of video game gambling, it's just about psychologically manipulative mechanics in games, regardless of what form they take, that encourage just constant addictive spending. And the only reason stuff like this hasn't been heavily scrutinized is because it's so new. It's only now that the conversation is getting traction. The law hasn't caught up to the emergence of these kinds of mechanisms. To finish this interview off, Hawley was asked what he would say if game companies approached him and told him that without loot boxes, they'll crash. To that, Hawley simply responded with, quote, "These are very resourceful people, and I'm sure they can design games that don't rely on gambling directed at children in the center of the game." I couldn't agree more. Plenty of companies can thrive without shady loot boxes and egregious pay-to-win microtransactions if they really try. There are plenty of companies out there right now just making games with the integrity intact that make plenty of money, that are doing just fine financially. But companies like EA will go for these loot boxes because you can make money so easily off of them, off of exploiting people's psychology. They don't want to put the effort in making a good product. They prefer to come up with money-making schemes, essentially. And you know, game companies like EA will have you believe that they need the loot box money because games are so expensive, but we all know by now that this excuse is complete and utter bullshit. When you look at how much of that money goes to executives' paychecks, when you look at how these companies try to avoid taxes, when you look at how much money these companies would make without the microtransactions and loot boxes, it's very clear that loot boxes aren't a necessity towards a successful game company. It's just an overindulgence. It's just companies wanting more for the sake of wanting more, for the sake of seeing their bank account, that number go up and up and up. So indeed, if loot boxes go away, game companies will find a way. The likes of EA will find a way. And companies like EA would be smart to start taking eggs out of the loot box basket and start putting them elsewhere and start focusing on quality products. Because from the looks of it, it's looking more and more likely that loot boxes are going away eventually. It may take some time, but I feel like it's a matter of when, not if at this point. But I guess we'll have to wait and see what happens. So yeah, that's all the important bits of information from this interview. Now, do keep in mind, I don't know much about this Senator Hawley. I don't know if he's a person I would actually vote for. I don't know if he has ulterior motives behind this anti-loot box bill, if it's all just, to promote himself, or if he actually believes in this cause. And I also won't say that government intervention, government regulation was the most ideal scenario. I would have preferred if the gaming industry regulated itself, but they kept refusing to do so. They have made their bed. They now have to lie in it. The gaming industry continues to be stubborn about loot boxes and their potential harm, so what option is there but to get the government involved? It's just sort of the natural course of things. This is what they get. They brought this on themselves, and if government regulation will ultimately result in the eradication of loot boxes and pay-to-win microtransactions down the line, then you know what? So be it. So there you have it, folks. These are one man's take on the whole situation and Jason's interview with Hawley. I'd love to hear what your take is on what's been said in the comments below. With that, I would like to end this news update and discussion video. Thank you for tuning in. To be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Yong Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Yong out.